is that while you might think that someone is a threat, they're not fundamentally evil. I think that we've become so polarized that we don't give Americans each other the chance to be better. Welcome back, amazing friends, people, to the Hopeful Majority. I'm your host, Manu Meal. I was away for the last 3 weeks. I appreciate everyone's patience, but we're back. And everyone has been talking about the Biden cover-up while I was off. The book written by Jake Tapper and Derek Thompson, people have been focused on it. Was there a malicious attempt behind President Biden's health cover-up? Was it similar to something like January 6th? Was it a threat to democracy? What does this mean for the moment now? Should we even be talking about the story? And so that's what we have to talk about today. Now, anyone that's new to the Hopeful Majority, welcome, because every Monday on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your content, we're focused on building a platform where people of nuanced views can actually have different, difficult conversations, especially at very polarized times. And our goal is to reduce polarization by having very interesting ways to look at the world. And today, instead of an interview, we're going to do a monologue. And the question that's on my mind is, what is the real story behind President Biden's health cover-up? And I don't think it's a question that a lot of people are often asking, because, yes, while I was away, I was still paying attention. I wasn't fully out for the count. So while I was paying attention, you have all these questions, but here's my view on the real story around President Biden's health cover-up. Here's what I think the actual root cause of why this is happening. Why are we having such moments and such consequential times where we live in very divided times? Why are we focused on such crazy stories when we need to be solving our problems? What actually enabled such a cover-up? What caused it? Why were people doing it? And I believe that the root cause, one of the symptomatic causes, is that we live in such a tribalized and polarized world that it enables some of our worst instincts. We live in such a polarized world where people go to the most extreme ends. And there are 3 reasons why. The 3 reasons why I think this is one of the symptomatic root causes that enabled this type of cover-up. Number 1 is that when you've convinced yourself that the other side is not only the enemy, but they're a fundamental threat to everything you believe in, you will go to any end. I mean, heck, I would. If I thought that someone was a fundamental threat to my family, I would go to any end to try and prevent that threat from materializing. You hear what I'm saying? And that's, I think, exactly what happened in the context of President Biden's mental health decline and overall health decline cover-up, is that I think the folks in the Biden White House, I think the Democratic Party broadly, has convinced itself that President Trump is such a fundamental threat to democracy that they must do anything to try and prevent that from happening, from materializing. It's something that Jake Tapper has talked about, Derek Thompson have talked about. It's something that people from across the different ends of the political spectrum have engaged on. And I think that this is truly one of the reasons why we need to start addressing the problem of polarization, addressing the challenges of tribalism, is that when you are locked in a 2-party system where there's an arms race down to the end, and where people are fundamentally locked in mortal combat because it's a zero-sum game, I think you continue to see crazy things like this. January 6th, the insurrection, another tragedy on our democracy, another tragedy in terms of how we actually treat the American people. But if you're somebody out there and you suddenly saw someone win and you think that they're a fundamental threat to everything you believe in, of course you would go out and engage in such a way. Now, that is not refuting the fact that the Democrats might be right in thinking that President Trump is a fundamental threat. That might also not be refuting the fact that the Republicans think that the Democrats are a fundamental threat. But the difference is in this question of affective polarization. And that's something that we talked about throughout the show. And here's what I mean by this, is that while you might think that someone is a threat, they're not fundamentally evil. I think that we've become so polarized that we don't give Americans each other the chance to be better, to be able to listen, to be able to engage, to be able to be heard. It's something that has come up repeatedly on a lot of guests. Like Batya talked about this on the last episode that we engaged on, as it relates to the media and the way that the media stories engage at this time. When we enable our worst instincts, we cannot turn into the people that we're fundamentally fighting. And that's, I think, a challenge at this time. That's a problem. It's that the Biden White House, I think, fundamentally in some ways became what it was trying to prevent. And imagine I told you that you have such a massive cover-up on so many different levels about a president's health, right, and a president's transparency. And meanwhile, the administration is talking about how transparent it is to everybody. That only exists in such a world where we're spiraling down to the end, where there's an arms race to the middle. How do we combat that? How do we change that? I think one of the keys is recognizing that there's a new divide in our politics, and that divide doesn't necessarily break across the left and the right. What that divide breaks across is, I think, people that fundamentally believe that the other side is evil and people that don't. I think people that believe that we're open-minded and listening and able to listen to each other, and people that don't believe that. I think people that believe that at this time, while national leaders might be highly polarized, the average everyday citizenry, people like you and I, still have a chance and should be able to engage with each other. So that's reason number one, is that I think the real cause, one of the real root causes, is the polarized system we live in. And it would have only happened in this world because the Democrats have convinced themselves that they could not let President Trump back into the White House. And in some ways, that may have cost them the election. Number two. What's number two? The right, I think the conservative right, was actually right to be pointing out President Biden's decline throughout the presidency. They continue to push on this. And now in hindsight, this was actually a story that I think a lot of people say was true. Makes sense. Jake Tapper himself from CNN is admitting it. So why did that argument not break through? Why did the right's critique that was right at this time, no pun intended, why did it make sense and yet it didn't break through? It's because we live in a media ecosystem. We live in a polarized environment in a politicized time where there is so much noise that everybody's crying wolf. If the right did not critique everything about the Democrats that they could find themselves on, maybe one of their critiques might actually break through. And this also applies to the left. We've built an environment where we have to tear down the other side at all costs. And sometimes you might actually be justified in tearing down the other side. And yet, how do people actually sift through the nonsense and the garbage of the status quo? I think that as we continue to build, as we think about how to lay the civic fabric for the future, as we think about platforms like the Hopeful Majority, as we think about podcasts, as we think about the media environment, I think we have to privilege truth above party at all costs. If we do not privilege truth above party, country over politics, people above the political system that we operate in, we will continue to live in a world in which we're constantly locked in political battle, where the losers are ultimately not the people that are profiting off of the outrage that we've built, but everyday Americans. The tragedy of this mental health and health decline cover-up is not the people that did the cover-up. It's Americans, right? The tragedy of what's going on in the status quo is that people are suffering because we built a politicized environment that enables some of the worst impulses. When it comes to the right critiquing President Biden, I think that if we actually critiqued each other on merits, on grounds, if we weren't extraordinarily catastrophic and catastrophizing at every single element, if every day the coverage wasn't President Biden, this is existential, maybe people may have listened. And same goes for the status quo right now as it relates to President Trump. The Democrats cannot at every moment in turn be critical, because there are some things that President Trump does that are right and that are accurate, that I think a lot of American people are behind. And there's a lot of things that could be egregious, that could be incredibly dangerous. But if you consistently critique, the argument gets lost in the chaff. You know what I'm saying? The argument gets lost in the chaff because we don't live in a nuanced world. We live in a world dominated by the outrage industrial complex. We've heard this been said across the board. In an environment where the media is focused on and driven by an incentive structure that's built on clicks, on attention, something that this show tries to stay away from and sometimes probably suffers because of, you fundamentally lose the ability to actually pursue truth, to pursue argumentation, to pursue the sense of understanding. And reason number three, why I think the fundamental cause of the Biden cover-up is polarization. It's the tribalized environment we live in. It's this constant back and forth arms race middle, is that in one of the most consequential elections in our history, we had these two candidates, President Trump and President Biden. Those were our two choices. I'm 26 years old. I've got now, I guess I'm kind of old. I think I'm in the mid 20s, late 20s. I don't know what you want to call it, but there's people that are younger than me. There's people that are older than me. What everybody uniformly agrees on was most people were not happy with their choices. Yes, you've got the MAGA base, and yes, I'm sure you've got the Biden, super squad, wherever that might be, though I don't know if that actually exists. And then you've got everybody else. And everybody else might have really strong views. Everybody else might have really strong beliefs, but they're not really driven to the polls because they care about President Biden necessarily. They care about President Trump. They're driven more because of fear of the other. You get what I'm saying? Because of fear of the other. And when you have every election happen where people are showing up to the polls, voting not for someone, but against the other person, we continue to affectively polarize as Americans. And as a result, you've got a media environment and a politicized system where the Biden White House has no incentive to actually tell the truth because the election is about the other person. It's not about him. It's about the other person. There's so many campaign ads that have been stated where they wanted to make the 2024 election not a referendum on Biden, but a referendum on Trump. Now, some of you might say, well, that's classic politics, Manu. You're being too idealistic, expecting something different. But you only have crazy shit like mental health cover-ups and health decline cover-ups, and you have crazy, incessantly threatening things like the January 6th insurrection in an environment that has become at odds with each other. And that would be my message, is while I was away, while I was off, trying to recuperate, rearm, not literally, but mentally, getting ready for the crazy political cycle and getting ready for what's ahead, I just have to urge us to understand and ask deeper questions. These news stories, there's going to be more things that keep coming out. I don't think we're even at the bottom. I think there'll be continuous nonsense happening in the future, threats that are truly existential. And they're going to come from across the political spectrum, in my view. I think they will. And the reason is because if you've convinced yourself that the other side is evil and a fundamental threat, and there might be real reasons to believe that, but the question is, how do you execute that fight? If you operate in a media environment where there's constant chaff and critique, you can't break through. And importantly, if you've built a system where everyone's voting against each other, you're only left with terrible options. And that system is just not sustainable. And that's the goal of this show. That's the goal of my fundamental argument. You may disagree with different parts, but I don't think we can have an American democracy 20, 30, 40 years down the line that is strong, that is effective, that is that shining city on a hill, that is an example for next generations, if you've built a system that is just constantly tearing down, that is constantly focused not on building bridges, but burning relationships and ties. And you might be asking right now, well, how do you have those conversations? How do you engage? Well, we've got a whole litany of episodes. If you go to episode 37, if you go to episodes for some of the early ones, like episodes 5, 6, we talk about some of these conversational tips. There's a lot that can happen. We engage with presidential candidates in the past. We've engaged with political leaders. We've engaged with academics. And importantly, we've shown our students, young people, bridging divides at a time when no one thinks it's possible. I say all of this because if we want to avoid a continuous decline, we need to build something more hopeful, more engaging, something that is not necessarily feeding into the current divides. And that's the goal of the show. I'm so grateful to you for joining us on this Monday. I appreciate you. Please leave a like, subscribe if you're on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple, leave a review. We're building this show together, one episode at a time. I'll see you next week. Take care.